Okay, so I know that Nikki has already tested the new CUPRA Born back when it was launched in its Spanish home base. And yes, I do trust her. I just wanted to know what the Born was like on a UK back road in the rain. And even though it isn't raining, because the rain has obviously stayed in Spain on some sort of plane, it's fine. I'm going to test this car in the UK. Now, for the record, I trust Nikki with my life, just not with my biscuits. And I am fully aware that I think those two things should probably be the other way around.
But before we get to the Born, just a quick reminder to like, subscribe and comment on whether you'd be tempted by a CUPRA Born rather than the very similar VW ID.3. Or maybe something else. What's the best electric hatch out there, in your opinion? So, the CUPRA Born. It's a 5-seat pure electric hatchback based on the same platform as the Volkswagen ID.3, but with a supposedly bit of a sporty CUPRA twist. The range starts at 34 grand for the slowest one with the smallest battery, up to just under 42 for the one with the biggest battery and the longest range. Although that's not the fastest one, because of the heavy battery. That would be this one with the right options, and also the most popular one in the UK, the CUPRA Born 58 kWh, which means it's got about 200 brake horsepower and a 58 kWh battery, good for just under 250 miles of range. There are 3 trim levels from V1 to V3, and this is a well-spec'd V3 which starts at £38,390. You got that? Good.
There's no getting away from the fact that this Born and the VW ID.3 are very closely related. The boxy proportions, the short overhangs, this window line and the C-pillar are all things you can't change. So if you stand back a bit and squint, they are twinsies. But I happen to think the CUPRA looks better. It's got a meaner look at the front, and all Borns sit slightly lower than ID.3s, so it's 15mm at the front and 10mm at the back. Now, it doesn't sound like much, but it does make a difference. And then when you add in the fact that most Borns have slightly wider tyres, this car has a much better stance than an ID.3. When you add in these little flicks in the side skirts, a slightly longer rear spoiler and really quite dramatic wheels. Now, these are standard on the V3 trim, they're 20 inches. Some people hate them, but I absolutely love them. The copper detailing, the extra little bits and bobs, this car becomes more than the sum of its parts. I think it ends up looking like the kind of funky training shoes that young people wear. Now, interestingly, this vapor grey colour is the only standard no-cost option. Every other shade is a £560 option, apart from Aurora Blue, which is £840. Although that does look really rather good.
If you've ever sat in an ID.3, the Born's interior won't be unfamiliar, but again, I like it more than the VW. All cars get a 12-inch central screen, and it controls everything, so it's a shame that some of the early ones couldn't be trusted. This one seems okay, though it's still a little bit laggy, and there's the usual suite of driver assistance systems and optional extras. Obviously, they get more kit as you move up the grades, but the base V1 trim gets 18-inch wheels, LED lights all round, adaptive cruise, a rear camera, 4 USB sockets, a DAB radio, aircon and a heated wheel. The other trims add progressively bigger wheels and even more functions, but it's not a bare car as standard. The Big Beats stereo is £450 worth spending, in my opinion, though you'd only want to shell out £925 for the sunroof if you really can't work the standard aircon.
In terms of the rest, well, the seats are super comfortable. They do feel slightly high when you first get into it, but you get used to it. And the heated/cooled seats feel even better. Bucket seats, by the way, are standard. There's also just a few more soft touch plastics than in the VW ID.3 and a few 3D little printed patterns that just make it feel that little bit more classy. And there's plenty of storage, from decent door pockets to this centre console, which, while not revolutionary, all works. And yes, I do like the copper accents.
This being a bespoke electric car, there's plenty of room in the Born. That is a 385-litre boot, and you can drop the rear seats if you need to hump something big around. Though there's no frunk, and the split floor in the boot is actually a cost option, so be aware that if you don't go for that, you might have charging cables all over the place. Mind you, a normal hatchback like a Seat Leon has a 380-litre boot, so it's slightly bigger than the average hatch.
Same goes for the back seats. There's plenty of space back here, although it's not exactly an opera house. It is a little bit lighter and brighter than I thought it was, especially looking at it from the outside, because these tints are actually standard on the V3 model. But you know what? It's pretty good all told, especially if you're comparing it to a more traditional petrol or diesel hatchback.
The Born comes with 3 possible battery sizes. A 45 kilowatt hour with 148 brake horsepower and 211 miles of range that isn't here yet. This 58 kilowatt hour with 200 brake horsepower and 249 miles, and a 77 kilowatt hour with the same outputs but a possible 340 miles of WLTP range. There's also the e-Boost Performance Pack, standard on the bigger battery car, optional on the 58 kilowatt hour, which has a little button on the steering wheel that gives you a jolt of extra power to just under 230 brake horsepower for 20 seconds, like digital nitrous oxide. Good for overtakes, but probably quite gimmicky. The 58 kilowatt hour e-Boost car is actually the fastest Born, being about half a second quicker to 62 miles an hour from rest than the car with the bigger 77 kilowatt hour battery pack. There's 11 kilowatt AC charging on all of them, with the 58 kilowatt hour like ours getting 120 kilowatt DC charging, and the 77 kilowatt hour battery getting slightly faster 130. That means 5 to 80% charge on a big 150 kilowatt public charger in around 35 minutes for both, even though one has a bigger battery. The smallest 45 kilowatt hour battery only gets 100 kilowatt DC charging, but hey, smaller battery, so again 35 minutes-ish.
Now it starts to rain. Anyway, home wall box, well, you're typically looking at about 9 hours for a 58 kilowatt hour battery and about 12 for the 77 kilowatt hour. And an efficiency aiding heat pump is a £925 option on the higher grades. I know this is all a big slew of numbers and figures, so if you want to know more, then please do log on to electrifying.com and we'll clear it up for you.
Right, this is an important bit because the CUPRA Born is supposedly the sportiest electric hatchback we've seen so far. According to CUPRA, this is an emotional driving experience and promises electrifying performance. Well, seeing as this is electrifying, we shall be the judge of that.
The basics look good. All Borns get a rear-mounted motor that drives the rear wheels, which I like, and they all get the option of a thing called dynamic chassis control, which is basically a system that allows you to have some say in how the suspension and damping feels. They also all get the option of a thing called e-Boost, which gives you an extra 30 brake horsepower for 30 seconds via a little button on the steering wheel. Unfortunately, I have none of those things because this is the most popular Born, it's not been optioned on this car, and nobody has as yet tried any of that stuff, so I can't tell you about it. Still, there's nothing wrong with the way the Born works. The battery, like all electric cars, is mounted quite low in the middle of the car, so there's decent weight distribution. The steering is a little bit light, but it's quite direct, and the brakes are fine. Although the e-Boost cars do get slightly bigger brakes apparently, and I can see where that might be nice. It's not hugely essential, but I kind of get that. But you know what? It goes around a corner with enough positivity to feel like a bit of a laugh. It doesn't heave around, the body control is good. There's also a setting here called ESP Sport. Now that's supposed to loosen off the traction control and give you a little bit more sort of playful handling, though I can't really tell much difference, so it can't be that mad. It's interesting that it's in there though, because CUPRA is supposed to be a slightly more sporting brand, so it's trying to give this car a little bit more character. It's not exactly a drift machine though. I think the issue is that although the Born is fast and flat and competent enough to hit all its numbers, the way it goes about things is just so undramatic that it never feels very sporty. It gets down the road, don't get me wrong, but is this an electric hot hatch? I'll have to say no, not really. See, the thing is, I can see why CUPRA has invented something like the e-Boost, because it's a manufacturer who is trying to give an electric car some sort of character. It's giving it just that little bit of extra thing to play with so that you get away from the fact that the drivetrain is essentially the same as all other electric drivetrains. It's very competent, it's very quick, it's very torquey, but it's not very exciting. The e-Boost gives you a gadget that makes you feel like you're making a difference. Don't forget, they could have put that extra 30 brake horsepower at the end of the throttle pedal rather than a button on the steering wheel, but it's just a bit more fun, I suppose. So it's good, though it's not quite as it might have been billed as a sort of electric fast car. Though that rear-wheel drive does have its advantages, it's still as quick, easy, punchy away from the lights, it's good for overtaking, and it has a really, really nice turning circle because the rear wheels are pushing while the fronts are doing the steering. It's all really quite nice. And even though the CUPRA has bigger wheels and slightly lower suspension than the Volkswagen ID.3, it still rides surprisingly well. These are all really good things.
Well, I prefer the CUPRA Born to the VW ID.3. It feels an ambiently nicer car, it's a bit more precise to drive but still as comfortable, and I prefer the way it looks. It's just as practical, and some of the interior finishes are just better.
I think the 58 kilowatt hour battery is probably the right mix of range versus weight, although the 77 kilowatt hour, the slightly bigger battery, isn't that much slower, and the appeal of a little hatchback with more than 330 miles of possible range is always appealing. As ever though, these cars aren't exactly cheap, especially if you option the bigger battery and lots of nice things. A 58 kilowatt hour Born starts at about £36,500, so once you've stuck a few options on it, it's probably nearer 40 grand. Now when you consider something like a base Kia EV6, which is a bit of an electrifying favourite, starts at £41,695, you're going to have to get creative with company car schemes, salary sacrifice and lease deals. Although they should be quite cheap to run. I've been getting between 3.5 and 3.6 miles per kilowatt hour, which is pretty good. Is it worth it? Well, if you can make the numbers work and this size of car suits what you need to do day to day, then yes, it's a nicely sorted, practical, slightly sporty electric hatchback. Is it an electric GTI? No, I've yet to find an electric car that actually is, but that's not too much of a problem. Now, I just need to find one with e-boost to see if it makes any difference.
If you want to know more about the CUPRA Born or any of its competitors, then please do log on to electrifying.com and we'll do our best to help.